Hello again and welcome to the Gospel of Mark, actually the program in which we think we will complete our study, our commentary. We should get, God willing, to chapter 16, verse 8 today. It's a pleasure being here again for the 25th time with Father Mike Lastiri, who is the Director of Worship for the Diocese of Fresno and Pastor of Immaculate Heart Mary Parish in Hanford, and Dr. Robert Maldonado from the Philosophy Department at California State University, Fresno. We could begin, I guess, by looking at the passages that we'll be discussing today. We are obviously in chapter 15. We're going to be looking at those last readings. We'll see Jesus delivered to Pilate, which we talked about last time, and the trial before Pilate, which we also discussed then. We'll look at the sentencing of Jesus, the sentencing to death, which we did discuss last session. We saw the mocking of the soldiers also. Today we're going to open with the road to Golgotha, a short little verse. Then we'll proceed to the crucifixion of Christ. We'll see his death on the cross, his burial, and the empty tomb, one after the other in one complete read. It's very important we think of Mark as the compressed gospel that you should be reading, as they say, in one gulp, one solid read. Well, let's begin then, Father Mike, if we could, with that road to Golgotha and the crucifixion. What does Mark have for us?
Okay, Jim. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mingled with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each would take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests mocked him to one another with the scribes, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him.
Robert, you did have something you did want to say about Simon, and I'm sure Father Mike has comments about some of the passage that he just read.
Well, Simon's an interesting character, and I just wanted to sort of point out that there's two main ways to take names, characters in biblical stories. One is that they are historical references, and many scholars think that this may be an indication of somebody who was in Mark's community, because Mark names him and knows him. But it's also interesting to think about symbolic meaning. And of course, one of the things that I find interesting in Mark is how rare Father as a word shows up. It's only 18 times in the Gospel and only 4 times on the lips of Jesus. And Simon is identified as the father of Alexander and Rufus. And those names are kind of interesting too. Alexander means the male of worth, of value, and Rufus, which was actually a fairly common name, means reddish. And so I can't help but think of the kind of drama that Mark is presenting between the king Pilate as the emperor's representative and the true king mocked, but ironically the true king Jesus. And of course Mark started his gospel all the way back at the beginning, introducing his disciples to this way that he's following and comparing them to King David, who was also red. King David was a redhead. So the true man of worth, the true king, Jesus, and the follower who is carrying the cross, which of course alludes back to the take up your cross and follow me. And so symbolically, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it seems like a really interesting moment that the true father person, Simon, is a father of people who are of real worth, namely the kind of of people that follow Jesus and walk with God.
Father Mike, any part in that sequence that you shared with us?
Well, it's interesting to note the whole crucifixion scene is very brief. Very brief in the sense that there isn't a long explanation of the crucifixion itself. It just simply say they crucified him. And Mark gets to the point. And, you know, we've all heard many times that crucifixion was a form of death penalty that was imposed among the lowliest of the criminals. But also it was put up there to show everyone else. That's why you put somebody on a hill and you crucify him so everybody could see. Sometimes you still have that kind of thing done by oppressing countries that you'll execute and place a body where everyone can see and, you know, and learn a lesson. This will happen to you if you don't behave yourself. And certainly you have that sense. But it's interesting, Mark, it's one line, it's done. Sometimes, certainly for us, liturgically on Good Friday, or, you know, we draw it out and, you know, and long homilies are given and so on. But in Mark, it's a very short point.
And what's so interesting, ironically, it is so short, and they crucified him, and yet it is exactly where Mark has been leading us all along. It's not a small point in the Gospel of Mark, the crucifixion. It's the essence of the gospel. It's a passion narrative. So it's beautiful that it's brief, but he's been leading us up to it consistently week after week, or for him in the one single read, because that gospel was meant to be read, as they say, in a single read. I wonder if we could read then the next passage and see if that even clarifies or even gives us more insight into the Gospel of Mark.
And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he's calling Elijah. And one ran, and filling a sponge full of vinegar, put it up on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come down to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. And when the centurion, who stood facing him, saw that he thus breathed his last, he said, Truly this man was Son of God. And there were also women looking on from afar, among them Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger, and Joseph and Salome. And when he was in Galilee, followed him and ministered to him, and also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem.
A wealth again of material, however compressed Mark makes it for us here at the crucifixion, the death on the cross. Where would you like to begin, Father Mike, picking out any verse, image, person, moment in this sequence that Robert read?
And again, I think we're very much familiar with my God, why have you forsaken me? It's the responsorial psalm that is sung on Passion Sunday. It's again repeated on Good Friday. And it's exactly that. It's a responsorial psalm. It is a psalm, and Jesus knew the psalms, and so that's Psalm 22nd, which comes back. But again, we make it a song of despair, if you will, but rather it's really meant to be something else. And it really is there for Mark to, if you will, exemplify that God was with him. And a common a thought for Mark would have been, this is a victorious moment, if you will. We said earlier, the crucifixion, it's one line, it's the exclamation point at the end of the story, and now this is kind of putting a little bit of color on all of that, how this was for Jesus, and certainly in Mark's understanding, the completion, the reality for Jesus, who his whole mission was to come to this point.
Robert?
I think that it's also important, though, that the suffering is real, right? He comes to suffer, and I suppose if he wasn't really suffering, even at this moment of extreme agony, then his mission wouldn't have been fulfilled either. So it's, I guess I still see some despair in it, as part of the sort of setting of the triumph, what ultimately is the triumph.
I guess one way is to even look back at the in the garden. There is this understanding of, was Jesus not trusting in the Father, or is it that he was abandoned? And on the cross, is he abandoned, or is he at a moment of tremendous turmoil? And what's so interesting, it seems, the way Mark, who is an artist and is really a genius, he has shown us bit by bit the abandonment of just about every single entity. There is his family, then there's the townfolk, then there's the disciples, then there's the casual people, and then there's actually going to be the crowd that was with him. And then on the cross he's getting reviled by criminals, and then he's also in some moment of inner anguish over, is it that you're going to leave me alone too? Come on, help me out here. I mean, I really think there's drama that Mark is brilliantly giving us glimpses of. Or am I crazy?
Well, I think there's the conversion experience too. You have the conversion of the Roman soldier who says, truly this is the Son of God. It's all of a sudden all those who would be normally unbelievers who are witnessing, and it's a story of witness, because the life of Jesus, as should be any life of the disciple of Jesus, by witnessing to something greater. And the witness of what's happening gives this guard, the soldier, if you will, all of a sudden the insight to say, truly, this is the Son of God. So by seeing what he sees, and certainly the others who see what they see, again, it's always those on the way, however they fall in, who have a deeper insight than those who've been along the road for a long time, who may still not have a complete picture of what's going on.
Yeah, this centurion is the first human being in the entire Gospel of Mark to identify Jesus as Son of God, which of course was God's voice from the beginning, right? At the baptism, God identifies Jesus as his Son. And so that's an extraordinary moment in terms of, you would expect Peter, one of the women, somebody who has been with Jesus to be that one.
Also, I think we can't let go of the moment, and again, the significance of the women who are there. Again, the women who come up in the gospel, and not just one or two, but several, who witness, who minister to, who are around Jesus at this crucial moment in the gospel, and certainly Mark's inclusion of these women in this particular critical moment, which again, it would in many ways break the kind of patriarchal system that would be in place, and kind of allows another insight that sometimes we lose out on.
One last thought, Robert, and then our break.
Well, it's just a little detail in at the moment of his death, but it does say that the temple curtain tears from top to bottom. Many see this as new access to the temple with the result of Jesus' death. I think more in the context of the time and in Mark, we might even see it as not only Jesus' agony on the cross, but God's, because the temple tearing could more likely, I think, refer to grief. When someone would die, you would tear your garment from top to bottom. And in so doing, you're expressing grief. So that's God's grief at the death of his Son.
One last thought about ripping garments. We saw the chief priest rip his garment and say, blasphemy. And it's almost like, the fella is almost saying, you've really, as if my child died, what you've just said is like a dagger to my heart. And to see God in agony with Jesus is not to be dismissed too lightly. What Mark is offering in this gospel is so rich, we should never think, that's so far a stretch, I can't even imagine that being there. Trust me, it may be there. On that note, we do take our break. We'll be back in a minute, so please join us as we reach the concluding chapter in Mark's gospel.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Hello again and welcome to what will be our final thoughts on verse-by-verse look at the Gospel of Mark. We'll be back again next week with our final wrap-up, but today we should be able to reach with you chapter 16, verse 8. Father Mike, if you could pick up at the burial of Jesus, let's see what there is that Mark is letting us see, and perhaps we'll see it as though for the first time.
And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate wondered if he were already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. And he brought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid.
Robert, first thoughts on the burial of the Christ?
Well, maybe backing up just a little in terms of the whole narrative, one of the things that's interesting that Mark's doing is presenting a whole bunch of different reactions to Christ on the cross, to Christ dead, to Christ being buried. Most of them are ironic or not quite fully proper. Well, obviously the reviling and mocking isn't. But even the women who are different from the men in that they're there, they are also simply just watching. They're not exactly responsive in terms of positively affirming things. So it's just really interesting to see the various reactions. And I think Mark wants the reader to sort of fill in the blanks, if you will, or respond positively, especially to the more negative things, to counter them. Again, this is a very terse narrative in terms of the burial of Jesus, and Mark doesn't tell us a lot. We, of course, know of Joseph of Arimathea from other Gospels, but Mark doesn't seem to give us too many details and makes him a kind of lone actor in getting the body. That's curious.
Father Mike, anything else in this little part you just read?
Well, again, if you will, the body, linking it to John the Baptist, linking all of that, the physical sense, laying in a tomb, rock, and as you know, we also use rock as a sense of strength. And so that he's buried actually in a cave, if you will, almost, instead of being buried into the ground. One of the things when you're in the Holy Land, you're amazed, if you will, what we refer to as the Valley of Death, between what is known as the Garden of Gethsemane and the city of Jerusalem. That's this huge area of graves. But when they take you to where is the tomb of Jesus, where he was believed to have laid it, a kind of an unusual place. I think, again, it's that whole sense, as Robert puts out, the irony, little parts that would not have normally been, and yet Mark kind of brings them to either fill in the gap or give us maybe a different meaning.
Robert, help me out on this one. Joseph of Arimathea, for Mark, is definitely not a disciple. He's definitely able, because of Pilate acquiescing to him, which he wouldn't have acquiesced to an apostle, to one of the 12. And yet the other evangelists just seem, they've just got to do it. They've got to make him a follower, even if it's secretly. help us uncover the ability of an evangelist to modify what might be the tradition they're working with and almost upgrade it or change it to that it's different than the way Mark sees Joseph. How does Mark see Joseph?
I think it's really difficult to be sure. What it says, he was looking for the kingdom of God and he took courage. So he is acting against Pilate, or at least willing to confront Pilate and suffer potential retaliation or punishment from Pilate. He's very similar to the scribe who is not far from the kingdom of heaven. And so I would see both that scribe and Joseph of Arimathea as not exactly crypto disciples, but certainly on the way and as positive characters. Mark has a trouble too, because if he depicts Joseph explicitly as a disciple, he puts him in the disciple camp, which has not been a positive character role.
It's almost more irony. One thing that Father Mike brought up, and we've done it all along, you must read Mark with an ability to appreciate irony, because it's over and over. And Robert made the point again today, things that are just not either appropriate or expected, count on it in Mark. There'll be something that's a little twist to it. And that's why the whole gospel is almost built on a cliffhanger. So let's move on. Do we want to read yet the empty tomb, or is there anything else left here, Robert and Michael, about the part we've just done? I think we can move on to the last 8 verses. We're going to read the way Mark, we think, closed his gospel, 16, 1-8.
And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week they went to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the door of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone was rolled back, for it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for fear and astonishment had come upon them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
That's the end. Well, it's the end for Mark, and I think we have to open up for Father Mike and Robert to help us appreciate the starkness, the complexity, and the mystery that it seems Mark is closing his gospel on. Robert, first stab, what is it that Mark wants us to do having read this gospel of his?
Well, I think the failure of the women to go tell is the biggest clue. Since we as readers by this point see the women doing the wrong thing or not doing the right thing, that puts more obligation on us to go tell. And so it's the failure of the women is one shocking, but in another sense it's not, because it's just one more of these Markan stories of the people you would expect to do the right thing not doing the right thing. So for all its abruptness and shocking quality, there is a sense of familiarity to it as well. Mark even sort of sets it up. The women are going to anoint the body because he's dead. And so they do not have a resurrection faith yet, because they are expecting him to be dead and to stay dead and to decompose.
Father Mike, on Easter, you often will have the challenge of preaching on this text. What is in here for you as a believer? How do we preach on Mark 16, 1-8?
Well, I think just as what Robert said is they didn't believe yet. They didn't see it. It hadn't been unpacked for them. They're living in the moment. These women and everyone is living in the moment. They have a dead body. They've anointed this body of somebody who they honored and loved, respected. Others feared. Others thought he was an enemy or rebellion or all those kinds of things. Because it's going to be another time and another place when the Spirit will come and share with them the gift of faith that will enable them eventually to believe or to fully understand. But this is not the place or time. Right now there is a mystery, and the mystery is death, and the mystery is a finality. And yet we know that that's the beginning of the story. It's not the end of the story, but in Mark it is that end of the story for them. And everybody is kind of coming into a closure. And whether they are afraid to tell what are these men that are already in the tomb, who are these figures, if you will, who tell the women to go tell the others. Why is Peter named particularly that he and then the others should come? Why does Mark point him out and not the other two, if you will? Because we always have Peter, James, and John and all those kinds of things. Though we do know that Peter tended to be probably maybe the most problematic figure. What's Mark trying to do with all that? And I think as a preacher, you're doing the same thing. You're trying to bring a sense of what it must have been like. Even as we talked earlier, this is a passion. This is everyone in suffering. Not only Jesus is suffering, but it's everybody suffering. Everybody in confusion. Everybody is wondering what's gone on. The whole idea of resurrection isn't going to come in yet because they haven't the gift of faith to believe through the power of Pentecost. And so I think it just is kind of bringing us to that human experience.
We have one more program next week to wrap all this up for you. We've left it a little bit untidy, but that's just following Mark. We will be back next week to be able to perhaps share a narrative analysis of the brilliance of the Markan Gospel. It is the first, it is for us the best, and we hope that you've enjoyed week by week our little look at chapter and verse. But next week when you join us, Father Mike and Robert will put together the whole 16 chapters in a single program, and we'll share with you what we think is the importance of this first Christian gospel. Till next week, God bless.